October 14th, 1944. Somewhere in the Apennine highlands of northern Italy, a dense shroud of cold morning fog wrapped itself around a narrow valley. The low, gray sky wept a bone-chilling dampness. In this quiet, broken only by the rare cough of a distant engine, Private First Class Finn Callahan knelt beside a long steel barrel poking out from a pile of rocks. It was a 57mm anti-tank gun, the American M1. A touch of rust bloomed at its seams, its surface slick with dew. Finn had nicknamed her Sweet Caroline, though he never told anyone why. Maybe it made him feel less alone. He hadn't slept all night. His fingers were numb from the cold. His lips were chapped from days without proper rest, but his gaze, the sharp, piercing gaze of his blue eyes, was locked onto the strip of gravel road ahead, barely wide enough for a jeep. He knew what was coming. They'd been tipped off the night before. A German tank platoon was moving south, falling back from the Caesar line. 5 tanks, probably Panzer IVs. The workhorse of the German army, nearly 25 tons each, thick armor, and 75mm guns that could punch through Allied armor like a tin can. Finn's position was a trap, deliberate but desperate. The valley was tight, less than 200 yards at its widest point. The Germans would have to come through one by one. That was his crew's only edge. But there was a problem. His gun crew had just 4 high-explosive anti-tank rounds left. 4 shots. A catastrophic shortfall for stopping 5 tanks. And even those might not penetrate the frontal armor. The rest of their ammunition was smoke. If they could knock out just 1 or 2 tanks in the right spot, the narrow road would do the rest. That's when the idea hit Finn. A trick he'd once read about in some forgotten training manual. To use the smoke not to hide, but to deceive. A psychological lure. His palms stung against the cold metal, his breath a white thread in the air. Fear and focus were one. At 900 hours, he slid the first white phosphorus round into the breach and whispered, "The show's about to begin." The cannon barked. A thick white cloud erupted onto the road, like steam from a burst pipe. Far up ahead, just beyond the second bend in the valley, the lead Panzer slowed. Its commander, peering through his periscope into the mist, was confused. Finn allowed himself the barest hint of a smile. They'd taken the bait, and the trap was just beginning to snap shut. The forgotten valley, and the kid who outsmarted tanks. On the American maps, this valley had no name, just a set of coordinates northeast of Verona, lost in the jagged folds of the Apennines. The locals called it Val di Ombra, though few outside the nearby village of Castellammare had ever heard the name. It was October of 1944, and the Allied Italian campaign, a bloody, grinding, and often forgotten meat grinder, was entering its cruelest phase. Weeks of rain had turned the roads to soup. Mud made trenches out of mountain passes. German rearguard units were falling back north from the Caesar line, blowing bridges, sabotaging railways, and leaving minefields in their wake. Every foot of forward progress cost American lives. Finn Callahan was with the 85th Infantry Division, 3rd Battalion, Ghost Company, a fictionalized unit, but modeled on the real outfits who fought in Italy. His platoon was tasked with covering a suspected supply route used by German armor to reinforce the front. Orders: delay or destroy any armored columns attempting to cross the valley. Finn's specific job was anti-tank gunner, a 19-year-old kid from rural Ohio, handy with mechanics and with a quiet disposition that hid a sharp, intuitive mind. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's repair shop, fixing tractors and engines. Long hours spent listening taught him how a machine was feeling by the sound it made. He'd never seen a tank up close until 2 weeks ago, when a German Panzer had lumbered over a ridge during a firefight and nearly crushed a rifle squad before an airstrike took it out. Since then, Finn had studied every scrap of information he could find. Armor angles, weak spots, turret traverse speeds. He was what the Army called a thinking soldier. Unassuming, not loud, but in the right position, deadly. His crew was 5 men. Corporal Leo Dyer, the loader. Private Rico Ortiz, the spotter. Technician 5th grade Sam Foster, driver of their half-track tow vehicle. And Sergeant Ed Kowalski, their section leader. A hard, sarcastic guy from Detroit who'd already lost 2 gun crews to mines in France. By the time they reached Val d'Ombre, they'd been fighting for nearly 3 months straight. No proper wash, no hot meals, no quiet nights. Just mud, fatigue, and the drone of enemy artillery somewhere in the hills. The terrain had been scouted the day before. Intel suggested a German tank platoon, likely from the Iron Eagle Panzer Grenadier Division, was moving through the valley to screen a supply convoy. 5 tanks, possibly supported by an anti-tank gun or infantry with Panzerfausts. Finn had 1 anti-tank gun, 4 high-explosive rounds, and a half-dozen smoke shells never intended for direct combat. But he had the terrain. The valley curved just enough to block a clear line of sight. Trees on either side offered concealment, and a shallow ravine behind their position provided an escape route. Finn started thinking like the enemy. What would he see through the fog? What would he expect? That's when the smokescreen idea became more than a theory. It became his plan. Getting inside the enemy's head, the birth of a smoke illusion. To understand why the ruse worked, you have to get inside the heads of the German tankers. By the fall of 1944, Wehrmacht crews were hardened by years of combat. Many had fought in France, on the Eastern Front, in North Africa. They'd seen every tactic the Allies could throw at them. They feared airstrikes. They feared minefields. But they did not fear American anti-tank guns. At least, not the 57mm M1. Compared to the German 75mm KWK-40 or the dreaded 88, the American gun was little more than a pea shooter. Even its shaped charge rounds, designed to punch through armor, struggled against the thick frontal plates of a Panzer IV, especially the Ausführung H or J models, which often came with extra side skirts and reinforced hulls. German crews were briefed that smoke on a battlefield usually meant one of 2 things: an incoming artillery barrage, or Allied troops falling back, trying to cover their withdrawal. Neither was considered a major threat to a tank platoon advancing in formation. In training, they were warned never to stop in smoke, but in a valley this tight, stopping felt safer than driving blind. Finn Callahan knew this. He also knew that while smoke can't stop a tank, it can confuse the men inside it. Tank commanders were deeply reliant on visibility. In close-quarters terrain like mountain roads or city streets, they depended on line of sight and coordination between vehicles. Take away their sight, and you break their rhythm. You make them hesitate, and hesitation was a killer. During basic training, Finn had read about a British unit in North Africa that used smoke shells not to hide their positions, but to create fake ones. They'd fire into an empty patch of ground to trick German tanks into thinking the main defensive line was ahead. The Germans slowed, redeployed, and exposed their flanks, right before the real ambush hit them. The tactic was called the Phantom Front. Finn wanted to try it, only not in the open desert. In a tight valley, where the road bent just enough to block the view, where sound echoed off the rock walls, where smoke, clinging low in the morning air, would linger like a ghost. He pictured it. 2 smoke rounds into the bend to make the Germans think the guns were just around the corner. Then, another one to their rear, making it look like an encirclement. Let them redeploy. Let them try to maneuver. Let them bunch up. And then, hit them. The key, Finn knew, was timing. The smoke had to appear deliberate, not random. Too much, and it would look like panic. Too little, and they'd ignore it. He would place his shots like breadcrumbs, one after another, drawing a line, creating the illusion of multiple firing positions. Let the Germans believe they were walking into a hornet's nest, when all that was waiting for them was a single gun. Sweet Caroline. Finn briefed his crew the night before. Kowalski raised an eyebrow. Ortiz looked skeptical, but none of them argued. What choice did they have? They had no armor. They had no reinforcements. All they had was a gun, a valley, and the mind of a 19-year-old kid who was just scared enough to be dangerous. The mist-painted trap, setting the stage. Before the storm, Finn was awake before dawn, walking the position again, taking a mental inventory of his meager possessions. A dented canteen, a photo of his sister in a baseball cap, and the feel of the trigger on his fingertip. He ran a hand along the barrel of the 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, listening for any telltale sound. The weapon was light, much lighter than the German beasts it was about to face, but that made it easier to move, easier to aim, and easier to hide in the folds of the rock. Light could be deceptive. He and Corporal Leo Dyer had placed the gun in a shallow depression, about 15 yards off the road, shielded by a low ridge and a copse of European beech trees. From there, they could see the bend in the road, but not the approach a half-mile away. It was a perfect choke point. A 30-degree angle on the gun allowed them to crossfire, creating the illusion of more firepower than they actually had. They tested the wind with a scrap of cloth tied to a twig. A light, steady downslope breeze, about 3 to 5 miles per hour, perfect for making the smoke lie low and linger in the valley. If the wind had shifted, they'd have scrubbed the mission. In a valley this tight, smoke could turn on you just as fast. Finn scratched a rough map in the dirt and ran the brief. Technician 5th grade Sam Foster would hide their half-track behind the wreckage for a quick bug-out if needed. Private Rico Ortiz, the spotter, would take a position on a low ledge to call out range and corrections. Sergeant Ed Kowalski would cover their escape route and coordinate 2 Browning M1919 machine guns, positioned opposite each other on the valley slopes. The Brownings weren't meant for the tanks. They were there to chew up infantry, disrupt movement, and make the valley feel smaller, deadlier. Their ammunition was laid out like poker chips. The 4 high-explosive anti-tank rounds, shaped charges designed to penetrate armor, were set aside for the killing shots. The rest, 6 smoke shells and 2 white phosphorus rounds, more often used for signaling or illumination. Finn's sequence was precise. 2 smoke shells into the bend to suggest a forward line of fire, then 1 deeper to hint at an encirclement. A pause, then a white phosphorus round to simulate a kill and provoke movement. Only after the tanks were bunched up would the high-explosive rounds come into play, aimed for the tracks and side armor where they were most vulnerable. They talked it through. Team, shot, smoke, pause. Shot, smoke to the rear. Pause, phosphorus. Pause, fire. Every action had a contingency. If the wind shifted and blew the smoke back on them, they'd call it. If the lead tank stopped and sent out engineers, the gun would fire low, aiming to disable, not destroy. If German artillery bracketed them, they'd be gone in 90 seconds. Finn's thinking was surgical. A Panzer IV's frontal armor could be up to 80 millimeters thick. The sides were often just 30. The M1's shaped charge rounds had little chance from the front, but against the side or the tracks, they were deadly. Disable 1 tank and it becomes a roadblock. Disable 2 or 3, and the rest would box themselves in. The shape of the valley was on their side. Near the bend, the road narrowed to barely 10 feet. Too narrow for 1 tank to pass another. If the lead tank stopped, the rest were stuck. Sound echoed off the rock walls, making each engine's roar louder, more disorienting. Panic would be louder than gunfire. Finn and Ortiz had ranged the landmarks. A jagged rock, A dead oak tree. A rusted road sign. They had drilled the crew's actions to perfection. Quick loads for the smoke. Instant switch to the high explosive. Speed was everything. This wasn't just about angles and armor. This was psychology. The smoke wasn't meant to hide. It was meant to suggest. Suggest danger, suggest more guns, suggest they were surrounded. Doubt would slow them. Slowness would make them bunch up. And bunched up tanks die easier. Luck was still a factor. But Finn intended to stack every other card in his favor, to lure the enemy into a trap and punish him for his mistake. By 8 in the morning, the final checks were done. The gun was draped in branches. The crew, silent, settled into the cold earth, nursing colder nerves. Ortiz spit into the dirt and muttered, "Let's make 'em believe what we want 'em to believe." Finn nodded and whispered the sequence one last time. Smoke, smoke, rear, pause, phosphorus, then fire. And somewhere in the distance, the German engines rumbled to life. The valley was ready to swallow them whole. As the iron beasts came out of the fog, it was just after 9 in the morning when the earth began to murmur. A low, metallic and grinding rumble, like an ancient beast stirring under the stones. At first, it was just a vibration in Finn Callahan's boots, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor that crept up the soles of his feet like a distant drumbeat. But it grew. The sound thickened into the clatter of treads chewing up gravel, the roar of heavy engines fighting their way uphill. The mountain valley, once still and silent, became a resonance chamber for war. And then shapes appeared in the fog. A dark silhouette punched through the haze, growing larger by the second. Angular, armored, and arrogant. A Panzer IV, its turret traversing left and right with the patience of a predator. Its hull was fitted with Schutzen, thin steel skirts welded to the sides to protect against Allied-shaped charge rounds. It moved like a steel-hided bull, utterly unhurried, as if it knew nothing could stop it. Another followed. Then another, 5 in all, each a gray beast clad in iron, clanking and groaning as it inched its way into the narrow throat of the valley. Their formation was disciplined, tight, German. Finn pressed his back against the earthen wall behind his gun, not blinking, listening to every clank, every breath of compression. The fog muted the world, but it didn't silence it. The morning air was heavy with moisture, and the smoke clung low to the ground, refusing to dissipate. The kind of fog that swallows light and keeps its secrets. If anything, it made every sound sharper, more intimate. The squeak of a road wheel, the hiss of an exhaust pipe, the metallic slam of a hatch. Every noise cut through the air like a knife. Ortiz was frozen on his rock ledge, scanning with his binoculars, feeding Finn hand signals. 5 tanks confirmed. No support vehicles yet. Range closing. Finn glanced through the gun sight. His heart was beating in time with the thud of the approaching tracks. He swallowed, his mouth dry. There was no room for nerves, but they crept in anyway, like a cold draft through a coat. The lead Panzer reached the bend, the one that blocked their line of sight just enough to make them cautious, to force them to press forward without knowing what lay ahead. Finn whispered to Dyer. The loader nodded and slid a smoke round into the breach. The first shot was quiet compared to what would follow. A dull thump. The shell arced out and burst in a white cloud that blossomed across the road like flowers scattered on the wind. And everything changed. The lead Panzer immediately slowed. Its turret stopped traversing. Its engine RPM dropped to a low idle. For a long half-minute, nothing happened. They weren't panicking. They were calculating. German tankers were trained not to trust sudden smoke. They searched for muzzle flashes, waited for infantry signals, and hesitated only when their radios gave them conflicting orders. It sat there, massive and still, as if sniffing the air. Inside that tank, Finn knew, were 5 men trained to believe American anti-tank guns were no great threat. But the smoke changed the equation. The smoke introduced doubt. Was this an artillery marker? A target for aircraft? Was the valley mined? Or worse, was there something else behind it? The second Panzer crept up close, forced to shorten the distance by the narrow road. Then the third. Then the fourth. The spacing collapsed. The whole column compressed into a steel chain with no room to breathe. On mountain roads like this, a stopped lead tank meant the others had nowhere to turn or retreat. The German doctrine of a tight convoy had turned against them. Now, Finn watched it with grim satisfaction. He loaded a second smoke round and fired it deeper into the bend, this time behind the lead tank, creating a pocket of smoke that hinted at an encirclement. The shell fell a little short, but it didn't matter. The crosswind in the valley pushed the smoke exactly where he wanted it. To a German commander peering through a narrow periscope, it would look like multiple Allied positions. Maybe 2 guns, maybe 3, maybe worse. Inside those tanks, eyes were darting, voices were rising, radios were buzzing. Men who had felt invincible 10 minutes ago were now shouting into headsets, trying to make sense of what they couldn't see. A scout half-track detached itself from the column and cautiously nosed forward, its headlamps cutting 2 glowing tunnels into the whiteout. It stopped short. Its commander was unwilling to go further. That was telling. Finn knew what was happening. He could feel it. The psychological pressure squeezing them. The fog, closing around their helmets like a noose. He had created it. With 2 shots, he had turned German discipline into confusion. The 4th Panzer tried to maneuver wide for a better angle, but its right tread slipped on the loose gravel and caught the edge of a rock face. Steel shrieked. The tank's progress slowed to a crawl, then stopped. Ortiz signaled. 3 tanks were now bunched together. The column was compressed into a stretch of road less than 100 feet long. They had nowhere to go. The entire valley seemed tense. Even the birds had stopped singing. The fog hung like a curtain, thick and impenetrable. The enemy was inside the funnel. Sight denied, formation broken, and command paralyzed by the weight of the unknown. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was a calculation. Both sides were waiting for the other to make the first mistake. Finn didn't fire again. He waited. Let them get nervous. Let them argue. Let the pressure build a little more. His hand hovered over the breach. The next round wouldn't be smoke. The next round would be steel and fire. He wasn't sure it would even penetrate the armor, but the sound alone might force the Germans to move. The fog becomes lethal. When illusion turns to fire, Finn didn't blink. His fingers curled tight around the firing mechanism as the last of the German tanks rolled into the whiteout, unaware it had stepped into a killing jar. To an untrained eye, the fog might have looked natural, just a morning mist that had lingered in the mountain pass. But to Finn, every inch of it had been sculpted like wet clay. Every cloud of smoke was placed where it would confuse, blind, and compress. The enemy had taken the bait. Now was the moment to strike. He gave the signal, a single, firm rap on the barrel, and Leo Dyer, crouched by the ammunition, slid the first high-explosive round into the breach. No ranging shot, no bluff. This one was for keeps. Finn drew a breath through his nose and fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he didn't feel it. All he saw was the shell streak through the fog and vanish until it met steel. He hadn't aimed for a perfect spot, just the lower track of the lead tank, praying the round wouldn't skip off the wet armor. Luck and angle had aligned. A flash blossomed in the mist, followed by a dull, wet thump. The lead Panzer rocked slightly, and a split second later, black smoke belched from beneath its side. One of its tracks went slack. The vehicle shuddered and stalled, frozen on the road. Finn didn't cheer. He traversed the barrel slightly. Second shot. This one hit the third tank, 2 vehicles back, just above the right track. It didn't explode cleanly, but it tore through enough metal to jam a road wheel and seize the tread. There was a metallic crack, and the 30-ton machine lurched sideways, one track shredded, its engine roaring. Its front end slammed into the back of the second tank with a shriek of steel and a shower of sparks. The slope of the road did the rest. With no way to reverse, the column had jammed itself, like a train in a tunnel. Now, the entire column was pinned. The second tank was trapped between the burning leader and the crippled one behind it. The road, already narrow, had become a tomb. German shouts erupted from the fog. Orders to dismount, commands to reverse, to regroup. But there was nowhere to go. A few tanks returned fire blindly, 75mm shells whistling high overhead and exploding against the valley walls. But the echo made them think they were being flanked from both sides. The tank column was choking on its own haste. Their discipline, their precision, had become a noose. On the ridge, the M1919s came alive. The staccato rip of the Browning machine guns echoed off the rocks like a death rattle. Orange tracers stitched through the fog, cutting into shadows. Finn couldn't see the German infantry clearly, but he could hear them. The scrape of boots on rock, panicked shouts, a body hitting the ground with a wet slap. The machine guns weren't meant to stop tanks, but they could mow down the men who got out of them. Finn loaded the third round, aiming lower this time, not for the armor, but the running gear. He fired at the drive sprocket of the fourth tank, and as the smoke cleared, he saw its right side buckle. The whole machine listed like a wounded animal curling into a ball. The Germans had stopped firing, not out of mercy, but blindness. They didn't know where the shots were coming from. The valley reflected everything. The machine gun fire ricocheted off both sides, creating the illusion of a full battalion. Finn's earlier smoke shells had compounded the problem. Every muzzle flash was instantly swallowed, giving the impression of dozens of hidden guns. The smoke refused to lift. The tanks couldn't traverse fast enough in this space. Their turrets swung slowly, hunting for ghosts. Then came the fourth shot, the last high-explosive round. Finn took aim at the rearmost tank, the only one with any hope of escape. As it tried to reverse, its left track slipped on the loose gravel, exposing its flank. He squeezed the trigger. The shot hit the rear plate and vanished into the smoke. For a moment, he thought he'd missed, until a sheet of flame erupted from the engine vents. The internal ammunition must have cooked off. The explosion that followed threw up dust and fire like a miniature volcano. The turret was torn from its ring and settled at a crooked angle. Now none of them could move. 5 tanks, 5 wolves, frozen mid-pounce. Some burning, some crippled, all trapped before the turn. Finn's crew worked in silence, exactly as they had rehearsed. Dyer called out, "High explosive is gone," Foster acknowledged, keeping the escape route clear. Kowalski stayed low, scanning the ridge for any sign of a counterattack. The air was thick now, not just with smoke, but with heat. Fire from the disabled tanks was spreading, black columns rising like tombstones. The smell of diesel, burnt rubber, and blood stuck in Finn's throat. And still, the enemy tried to fight. A few Germans, maybe engineers or an infantry escort, began setting something up behind the wreckage, perhaps a demolition charge to clear the road. But they couldn't stay on their feet long enough. The M1919s would let them get 5 feet, then cut them down. Finn slid a smoke round into the breach, not to hide, but to maintain the illusion. He fired one in front of the column and another to the rear. Let them think more guns were waiting in the fog. Fear, he knew, could spread faster than fire. That was the real weapon. Not the shells or the smoke, but the thought that the enemy was surrounded by something he couldn't see. Inside those disabled tanks, the crews were likely arguing, choking on fumes, calling for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. They had been taught to trust their armor, to trust their numbers. But numbers meant nothing here. Not when every inch of road was death, every exit blocked, every sound warped beyond recognition. And not when one 19-year-old farm kid from Ohio had turned a few smoke rounds and 4 live shells into a force multiplier. Finn ducked behind the gun shield, listening as the battlefield settled into that eerie in-between state, where the shooting stops but the dying isn't done. The valley no longer echoed with German power. It whispered of American cunning, the counterpunch, and the collapse of order. The smoke didn't lift, but the panic shifted. What had started as a confident advance, an armored thrust through a narrow valley, had devolved into chaos. The radios inside the German tanks crackled with overlapping voices. Orders were being given, but no one seemed able to execute them. A battlefield that had once operated with synchronized precision had become a mess of guesswork, hesitation, and survival instinct. Finn stayed on the gun, unmoving. The last of his high-explosive anti-tank rounds was spent. All he had left was smoke and a single white phosphorus shell he hoped he'd never have to use. The ridgeline above remained quiet. Ortiz signaled from his perch. Movement behind the wreckage. German infantry was organizing, maybe 40 or 50 yards from the head of the crippled column. Not retreating. Not yet. Sergeant Kowalski slid into the foxhole beside Finn, his face slick with sweat and grime. "They haven't quit," he muttered. "Probably engineers trying to break through." Finn nodded. Of course they were. The lead tank, now belching smoke and coughing flames, wasn't just a wreck. It was a cork. If the Germans could get it out of the way, the survivors might still push through. Finn looked at Dyer. "Load smoke." Dyer hesitated for a split second, just long enough for his thoughts to be clear. "We're out of real firepower." But he complied, slamming the round home. Finn fired into the wreckage zone. White mist blossomed again, swallowing the engineers, their charges, and any hope they had of a clear path. The battlefield was formless again, just how he wanted it. But this time, the smoke didn't buy time. It bought fear. The German crews who had once trusted in steel and doctrine were now bailing out, falling back on foot, scattering into the brush like rats from a flooded trench. The M1919s chattered again. Ortiz picked off 2 dismounted men with his M1 carbine. The sound of retreat, ragged, uncoordinated, was unmistakable. And then came the first real answer. For nearly 10 minutes, the valley held its breath. German voices shouted commands through the smoke. Engines revved and died, but no organized counterattack came. Then, finally, a new sound cut through the haze, low and measured. From somewhere on the slope, behind the German line, a deeper thump echoed down the valley. Artillery, or worse, a direct-fire 88mm gun, repositioned to counter them. A shell screamed overhead and exploded behind the American gun crew's position, throwing dirt and rock into the air. The first round was off, too high. The standard German bracketing would follow. 1 short, 1 long, then fire for effect. They had minutes, at best. Not accurate. Not yet. But they were dialing in. Foster yelled from the rear. "They've spotted us!" Kowalski swore under his breath. "They're gonna start walking it in." Finn had 2 choices: stay and risk being swept off the mountain by a lucky shot, or go all in, playing the bluff to its conclusion, and hoping the Germans would believe more than 5 Americans were hiding in the smoke. He made his choice. It wasn't bravado. It was probability. The enemy couldn't see him, and uncertainty was his last ally. Another smoke. High arc. Dyer loaded. Finn aimed further back, toward the German rear. When the shell burst, the smoke drifted unevenly along the ridge. But from the German perspective, it could have been movement. Advancing troops, perhaps. A few seconds later, a second German shell came in. But this time, it sailed completely over, exploding harmlessly against the far valley wall. Their line of sight was broken. It was working. For the Germans, there was no clear front, no known enemy positions, no reliable way to communicate between the burnt-out tanks and the gun crews further back. Their world had become smoke, noise, and dead weight. Inside the second crippled Panzer, a surviving crewman finally broke. He scrambled out of the hatch, pulled off his helmet, and raised his hands. A white handkerchief fluttered in the fog, then another, and another. The surrender started not as a mass gesture, but in pieces. They weren't broken by fire. They were blinded, deafened, and cut off. Radios jammed by the terrain, commanders lost in the smoke, and every man convinced the rest were already dead. A few men, then a dozen, crawling or limping toward the sound of American voices. They looked stunned, bewildered, like men walking out of a storm they didn't understand. A few still fired a round or two into the fog before realizing no one was firing back. The surrender spread just like the fear had. Quietly, and then all at once. Finn didn't speak. He just watched as the enemy began to understand what had happened. They hadn't been outgunned. They'd been outthought, outmaneuvered, and out-imagined by the fog. When the smoke cleared, the quiet victory of a thinking soldier. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was the crunch of boots on gravel. It was the hiss of fire, still licking the insides of the crippled tanks. It was the low, whining groan of an engine trying to turn over, the last gasp of a machine that didn't know it was already dead. Finn Callahan slowly stood up, his knees stiff, his hands trembling with the aftershock of combat. His ears were ringing, not from any single blast, but from the accumulated weight of sound, the kind that stays with you, the kind that doesn't leave even when the valley falls quiet again. He didn't feel triumphant. No one did. The wreckage before them looked like something from a painting, surreal, gray, and twisted. 5 Panzers, each in some state of ruin. One was burning openly, smoke coiling like fingers toward the mountain sky. 2 were completely disabled, holes in their armor, gaping like crushed insects. Another was still running, its engine rumbling, its turret frozen. But there was no one inside. Its crew had bailed out long ago into the fog. The 5th was silent, half shrouded in the mist, as if it had simply given up. The surrender had been piecemeal. 22 Germans in all, tankers, mechanics, and 1 field officer, emerged from the smoke and laid down their arms. None of them looked defiant. Most were covered in soot, their faces tight with confusion and shame. Some still clutched field manuals or radio headsets, as if waiting for a better explanation. One of them, a young Panzer commander with a torn sleeve and an iron cross on his jacket, looked at Finn with a gaze that held no hatred. It was disbelief, as if he were trying to process what had just happened. 5 tanks, over 20 men, stopped dead. Not by air support, not by a company of infantry, but by smoke, and by a gun they had once called obsolete. Finn didn't speak to him. There was nothing to say. He sat down behind Sweet Caroline, his anti-tank gun now scorched and hot to the touch. He put his helmet beside him and looked at his hands. They were black with powder residue and shaking slightly. His trigger finger was raw from the recoil. Dyer came over and dropped a canteen in his lap. "That was the last one," he said, not meeting his eyes. "Last smoke round. We're empty." Finn took a drink and nodded. Behind them, Sergeant Kowalski was directing the disarming of the German prisoners. Foster was radioing the results back to headquarters. 1 platoon of German armor destroyed. No American casualties. I repeat, no American casualties. Finn couldn't believe it, even as he heard it spoken aloud. Ortiz sat quietly nearby, his legs dangling over a ledge, watching the smoke thin as the sun climbed higher. The fog was lifting, both literally and figuratively. And now that visibility was returning, the wreckage looked even more real, more terrible. Finn looked down the valley and saw what the smoke had hidden. Not just tanks, not just flames, but men. Some were still moving, others were not. The trap had worked, every step of it. The smoke had shaped the battlefield, not by hiding what was there, but by making the enemy fear what could have been there. That was the real weapon: suggestion, illusion. The power of one man's imagination, projected through mist and steel. He hadn't just fired shells. He'd written a script the enemy had followed to the letter. And now that it was over, all he felt was a kind of quiet in his chest. A weight, not of guilt, but of the knowledge that what happened here today wasn't going to leave him anytime soon. The smoke clears, but what it reveals does not. War is often remembered in numbers. Tanks destroyed, casualties taken, miles advanced. Historians count victories by divisions, by operations, by fronts. But sometimes, very rarely, the outcome of a battle hinges on a single, invisible moment. Not a bullet fired or a hill taken, but a thought, a hesitation, a bluff played at just the right time. Finn Callahan didn't change the course of World War II. His name didn't make the papers. There are no monuments to him, no museum displays of his gun. But in one forgotten valley, on one foggy morning, he rewrote the rules of engagement, not with firepower, but with perception. He used smoke not to hide from the enemy, but to show the enemy what he wanted him to see. He didn't outfight the enemy. He outthought them. And maybe that's the part we forget too easily when we talk about war. We think of strength, of weapons, of destruction. But sometimes, the victory belongs to the quiet mind, the one who sees what isn't there yet, and makes others believe it is. Finn's story isn't about smoke. It's about clarity, the kind that only comes when everything else is burned away. What do you think is more important in war? Firepower or fear? Let me know in the comments below. And if stories like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe. There are plenty more forgotten feats of courage waiting to be told.